My name's Emily Wilkinson. I'm a Principal Research Fellow at ODI Global. And it's my great pleasure to be moderating this discussion. This is session 2 of the conference, Bouncing Back: How Important is Disaster Risk Finance Becoming? We're going to answer that question. To make this session a bit more lively, we're going to be running it in a sort of debate club format, so take you back to high school, debating teams. So get ready for some friendly but thought-provoking exchanges. There's no prize, there's no winner, but we'll have some strong positions. So on one side, we have Team Resilience Rising, or R squared for short, featuring two fantastic speakers, Mohammed Maalim, who is Senior Policy Advisor at the Ministry of Planning, Investment and Economic Development in Somalia. And we have Shakira Mustafa, who's Head of Evidence at the Center for Disaster Protection, Team Resilience Rising. And on the other side, we have the Resilience Revolution, made up of an equally impressive group of colleagues: Catherine Gibson, financial advisor at the Ministry of Finance in the Bahamas, and Kip Koski, who is Director of Strategic Partnerships and Policy at the Insurance Development Forum. And hopefully online, we have Isatu Kamara from the Directorate of Climate Finance at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs in the Gambia. There she is. Hi, Isa. So please join me in giving the teams a warm round of applause, as this is going to be a very exciting debate. Before we jump into the debate, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit. We've got two really interesting topics today, and they're closely linked, but tackle different sides, I guess, of the same challenge. The first one is more of a policy question, and it's about priorities, whether governments with tight budgets, limited resources, should really be setting money aside to prepare for shocks, or whether that's really just too much to ask when there are more important urgent needs. So that's the first kind of policy question that will be debated. And then the second topic is about, takes us into the public finance world, and it's about the how governments should actually use the money for disaster risk finance once it's available. So should funding be tied to specific plans that are established in advance, how the money can be spent just after a shock, or should there be more flexibility so governments can act fast when disaster strikes and use the money as is needed? So think of the first debate as exploring the what and why, and the second digging into the how. And together they sort of give us a kind of fuller picture of some of the critical issues in pre-arranged finance and preparing for disasters. Okay, so we're going to start with topic 1. This is the debate topic. Preparing and arranging financing ahead of shocks is a luxury and is not a priority for most lower income and capacity constrained countries like small island developing states with limited fiscal space and other more pressing development needs. So you can see the debate topic here. And I'm going to turn first to the Team Resilience Revolution. And over to you, Catherine. You have 5 minutes. What do you think?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So our view is that preparing and arranging financing ahead of shocks is not a luxury and should be a priority for all countries, even lower income, capacity constrained countries with limited fiscal space and pressing development needs. If we have learned anything over the past 2 decades, and from the discussion this morning as well, particularly as we face the existential threat of climate change, it is that shocks will come in one form or another. A recent assessment by the IMF reveals that macroeconomic impacts of disasters can create a vicious cycle that lowers growth and increases debt, especially in small and vulnerable states. As a result, governments are seeking to shift from reacting to disasters to getting better prepared for them, some going so far as to incorporate strategies to secure prearranged financing into their macro fiscal policy. Without prearranged financing following a disaster, a government could rely on post-disaster financing instruments like budget reallocation, borrowing, taxation, and international aid. However, these options can be time-consuming, which can delay disaster recovery and reconstruction. Borrowing post-shock can also be costly, which may negatively impact the fiscal position and economic growth. And of course, we all know what's happening with international aid now. Prearranged risk financing instruments provide governments with immediate access to funds and mitigate the negative impacts of disaster on economic activities and future fiscal costs. The range of prearranged financial instruments is growing and includes contingency funds or grants, contingent loans, parametric insurance, climate resilient debt clauses or debt pause clauses, and cat bonds. It should be noted that not all of these instruments require a reduction in financing lines available from multilaterals, which increases the opportunity cost of contingent loans. And of course, that's a concern for many countries. While cost is viewed as a barrier to the use of these instruments, it should be noted that development partners have recently taken steps to reduce the direct cost of prearranged finance instruments to lower income and climate vulnerable countries through subsidies or contingent disaster grants and concessional loans. However, cost should not be the primary determinant of which instrument a country uses. Cheapest isn't always best. A country has to determine which instrument can meet the government's objectives and the needs of the community. As with any significant government investment, a determination has to be made as to where there is greatest value for money, which is something governments are not always able to do with prearranged finance instruments due to their complexity and the opaque nature of some products. This complexity in particular has led to disappointing outcomes for some in using certain products, insurance and cat bonds in particular. There is help available in evaluating these instruments, however, through agencies like the Center for Disaster Protection and other independent entities. Prearranged finance instruments are most effective when steps are taken in advance to ensure proper use of funds. For example, financing can be tied to efficient and transparent disbursement channels to ensure that resources reach the right beneficiaries at the right time. These instruments can go even further to promote preparedness and recovery by requiring the adoption of clear rules that support additional measures to strengthen resilience of damaged assets. In summary, prearranged finance instruments allow governments to protect their people and economies by having financing and response plans in place before a shock happens, so funding can be released at the right time and reach the right people when they need it most. Lower income, capacity constrained countries with limited fiscal space and pressing development needs cannot afford not to use these defensive instruments to protect their economies and their people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A compelling argument, I think. Let's hear from Team Resilience Rising. Do you agree with the statement, Mohammed?
Thank you very much. I would politely like to disagree with this statement. And luxury, of course, is defined in modern economics as a product for which demand increases disproportionately as an income rises. So, just also like to use that in our early school days, we were taught the Maslow style hierarchy of needs. And And I think that actually essentially mirrors with the basic fiscal survival and the emergency response at the base, and fiscal resilience to shocks. So basically, if you are at the bottom of the chain, sometimes you trying to survive rather than trying to achieve luxury things. I'd like to use three key factors in this: money, politics, and capacity. And if I want to start money first, the reality is that many governments are under immense fiscal pressure, and they're struggling to meet day-to-day obligations such as paying civil servants salaries, servicing debt, and funding essential infrastructure like roads and electricity. So in this context, asking government to set aside resources is extremely difficult. And it's a difficult proposition, and opportunity cost, of course, are always high, and the trade-offs are quite stark. So it's very difficult in that sense. And I want to use an example of where I come from, Somalia. I think a lot of you would know that Somalia achieved a debt relief of about 4.5 billion by the end of 2023, if I'm not mistaken. And we reached a HIPC initiative, completion point, heavily indebted poor countries. And that means we're only starting to get access to international funds. We're trying to get our grips on things, international financial institutions. We're trying to get more grants, etc., climate resilience and funds and so on. So it's very difficult for countries like us to put that money aside. And the other area which is very difficult is politics, because arranging financing ahead of shocks, for example, is often politically difficult to prioritize in lower income and fragile states like ours. So short-term political incentives often undermine investments in DRF. Election cycles are too quick. We have 4 or 5 years all the time, and politicians like to prioritize visible, immediate projects. In other words, low-hanging fruits. So they don't see this as a long-term, and low political visibility. Preventing disasters doesn't make the headlines all the time. They're not always, unfortunately, being prioritized. So for political reasons, also is extremely difficult. The other point that I'd like to make is the capacity, right? Pre-arranged finance is also not a priority to lower income and fragile countries due to limited capacity. And it's true, because if you look at the technical expertise needed and the information systems, institutional processes, the data. For example, I'll give you another example on data. Like in where I come from, we have plenty of data. But sometimes when you're making key decisions like this, data becomes very scarce, because data is stored in so many different areas. So it's not coordinated, it's so much scattered, and it's extremely difficult to use that data in one set. So everyone will ask you, oh, we've got like health data, we've got climate finance data, we've got displacement data, etc. But where is it? Oh, it's in the vaults of the UNDP or in UNICEF. Yeah. And it will take months and months to collect that. And that's due, I think, to also capacity. So it's extremely difficult to get organized, have the right capacity to be able to undertake this. So again, I'm politely disagreeing with my colleague. Thank you very much.
Very important and common points that we can come back to, that will be shared with other countries as well. Okay, I want to give Team Resilience Revolution a chance to come back in and maybe counter some of the points that the other team has made, or we can nuance the conversation as well if you also agree with some of those things. But yeah, let's hear again from Resilience Revolution, Kip and Isa.
I'm here as sort of causing the bit of the chaos. I think Catherine and Isa are going to sort of help us sort of stay on course. But I was brought in to bring a bit of chaos. So thank you to my brother from the other side and my neighbor for starting the debate off. I think to your point on sort of the luxury element in terms of looking at what is actually survival and what we actually try to do. And a lot of the speakers ahead of us sort of spoke about the education, the health, and this the luxury element tag put on prearranged financing. I think it's sort of rightfully or wrongfully sort of put there because essentially this is what we're trying to protect. That survival aspect. I look across here and I see somebody working on the education front and on disaster risk financing. So I think the luxury tag might be a bit overused. Directly to your points on sort of the money, the politics, and the capacity. And I'm going to use sort of examples that have been spoken about earlier this morning. And the money part, I think we always put it as sort of an opportunity cost and sort of the cost of risk, and we're pricing it as a negative. Why don't we look at it as a positive in the sense of sending market signals? So Somalia, you've recently come out of that debt issue. Cat bonds are a great way of raising funds, but they're great ways of sort of signaling to the market that you are taking this risk quite actively. I come from the insurance world, and I think when we see generally when this contingent capital is sort of put in place, it's a signal to the market to sort of say, okay, this is a country that's taking its risk seriously. This is a country that's sort of ready to sort of elevate the conversation to the next level. There's a seriousness, a signal that you're sending to market when you look at that. So it's I wouldn't look at it as necessarily always a cost. There is a cost to it, but there's an opportunity to it. And I guess that moves on to the next point in terms of the politics around it. And the reason, and you correctly mentioned it, there is a political vacuum right now in terms of who's the leader in the room, who's the adult in the room. And there's that confidence that sort of needs to be built into the political system. And Andy this morning was sort of asked a question in terms of has there been examples in the UK in terms of public-private partnerships where there's worked, where things have actually scaled? And I'd point to Flood Re and Pool Re, where the UK government and the UK Treasury were instrumental in setting up a flood insurance program for the whole country. So I don't live near a river, or a water body, but I'm paying flood insurance as a secondary fee and added to my annual policy to support somebody else who can access that. So that was born out of politics. The politics of the day needed to sort of stand up and be accountable to the people because this was a risk that people are facing. So there is an opportunity for politicians as well to sort of take this and say, how do we make this work for our people? Lastly, and I can leave Isatou to sort of jump in, is the capacity. 100% agree. We have tons of data. We have tons of people sitting on 100 million vulnerability indexes and the hazards element and how you look at risk. And I was very happy to sort of see the resilience sort of equation put in there this morning and being depressed in terms of how things are getting worse. But there's a reason why somebody asked about the private sector today. This is not only a government aspect. If you build your institutional capacity at local level, build your insurance capacity at local level, build your banking capacity at local level to be able to take some of this risk. A good example of that is, for example, we're just talking to the lady from Lagos, they're coming on to the flood insurance scheme that we're developing with them. But that capacity was built over 2-3 years. It's a complex risk. It's something very complex to do, but it's I don't think it was done necessarily because the government went to do it, but we also built the local capacity of the insurance companies to be able to do it. So it's not, you're not in this alone. There's other people in the ecosystem who want to help. So I'll pause there and ask Isatou if she can help me sort of structure my arguments a bit better.
Thank you so much, Kip and Kathy, and thanks, Emily. I hope everyone is hearing me. Can I continue?
Yes.
Okay. So to respond to Muhammad's argument, for me, I would begin by underscoring one truth. and it is never the storm that bankrupts nation, but rather it is the silence before it, the failure to plan, and the cause of unpreparedness. So to put it simply, climate vulnerability is not about geography, but it is about capacity, physical space, and institutional preparedness. So, and these are the true yardsticks that define a country's exposure. So preparing and arranging financing ahead of shocks is therefore not discretionary, but it is fundamental to macroeconomic stability and sustainable development, contrary to Mohammad's argument. So that said, I would want to highlight three powerful reasons why pre-arranged financing is vital and not optional, especially for low-income capacity-constrained countries like the Gambia, Bahamas, and others. So the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of preparedness. And numerous studies have demonstrated that every dollar invested in preparedness saves between $4 to $7 in response and recovery costs. So this is why it's very important for us low-income countries to really ensure that we are prepared in advance for climate shocks. And for example, as well, the World Bank has estimated that nearly early financing rather can reduce humanitarian response cost by up to 60%. So which basically means that physical prudence in the age of climate breakdown requires financing resilience ahead of shocks. And the unplanned, and the next point I would say is that unplanned responses drains scarce physical space and disrupts development. So when shocks hit without financing arrangements in place, governments are forced to reallocate funds from schools, hospitals, infrastructure, etc., for long-term development and other long-term development priorities. So, which is the reason why it's very important for small countries like the Gambia to have these prepared plans. So, and I would want to give here an example. For example, for the case of the Gambia, in 2022, we had this severe flooding that has really disrupted our economy and livelihoods of many people. So nearly half of the country's districts were affected, destroying homes and infrastructure. And the damages estimated was over 5% of GDP. And without pre-arranged financing mechanism, the government was forced to divert funds from essential services such as health, education, and etc. to meet emergency needs. So this is really disruptive to social development. So which is why it's very important really to have prepared financing ahead of shocks. And I would say this is not a competing priority. It protects other priorities. So in fact, I would say failing to prepare is the real luxury that countries at the front line of climate shocks cannot afford. And the last point I would want to also mention is the fact that proactiveness really strengthens resilience, while reactiveness perpetuates dependency. So a proactive approach really allows government to respond rapidly, reduce humanitarian suffering, and maintain investors and citizens' confidence. So by contrast, I would say reactive approaches often results in delayed aid and prolonged recovery. So being proactive is not a luxury to point out or conclude my point. And I would say this is the lifeline of many small capacity contained countries like the Gambia. Thank you, and over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's great. So we've heard that the costs of not having that there are additional costs of not having DRF in place, that there may be some additional advantages and that you can overcome some of the capacity constraints that were mentioned before. I'm going to give a final sort of turn to Team Resilience Rising to respond, and afterwards there'll be opportunity for questions and comments, interventions from the audience. So do start thinking about what you would like to ask the teams, or how you'd like to come in. But over to you, Shakira.
So I agree with both sides. I mean, to be honest, guys, if you don't like the debate topics, blame me because I chose them, because these two topics are things that keep me up at night. I've been working in public finance for more than 15 years now. I was PFM, debt, and last 3 years disaster risk, because I'm from a small island state. This is very like, it's a macro critical issue. I see it happening every year in my country, in my region. And I just know from, you know, the advisory work I've done when I was in government as well, if I go to a minister in office and say, Minister, we need this instrument for that shock that may happen, a 10% probability of happening in any given year, 1 in 10 year return period, or 1 in 25%. He will look at me and say, Shakira, I need to pay these bills. How are you going to help me with that? Do you see the interest rate? You know, do you see what that we have these arrays building up? And like, for me, when I in that situation, it does feel like a luxury, because we are in a lot of countries limited fiscal space. In the Caribbean, we have high debt burdens. Growth is slowing down for the various shocks that we spoke about in the first session. I agree that, you know, disaster risk could derail that, and it's amplifying that, but how do you juggle and make these trade-offs? And I could do the technical arguments that shows, you know, every dollar of this saves you this, but the politician is going to look at me and is like, okay, and so so how do I, you know, really make that point that, you know, you have solutions available that will help you achieve multiple objectives, right? And I think that's what Andy and them was saying, right? We have to recognize we don't know what's happening every year, but we know shocks are going to happen. So, you know, what are the solutions are there in place that it's mutually beneficial, or at least, you know, the trade-offs is reduced. I will say, like, I think the first team that you spoke a lot, you mentioned that there is increased donor support for pre-arranged financing, and there's some interesting things that's happening in this space to make it more affordable for governments and to reduce that opportunity costs. For the World Bank, IDA countries, if you get a IDA CAT DDO, a portion of that comes from your country resource allocation of concessional, but 75% comes from a general pool of resources. So you're actually getting more access to grants and concessional resources. There's more premium support through things like the Global Shield, to ADRIFI and the African Development Bank, helping countries pay for their insurance premiums. But it's not enough. And there's still really, the protection gap is enormous in countries. So it's not enough. Budgets are shrinking and all these other pressures. So how do you, you know, make sure you're prioritizing the thing that gives the most benefit to the country and makes the best value of limited donor resources and public resources? So one last thing I wanted to make a point that I really grapple with is like, which layer of risk you're looking at, right? So we talk about insurance, we talk about cat bonds. That's, you know, for those instruments are most cost effective at high risk layers. So that's, you know, 1 in 10 events and higher, right? It's not cost effective for risk. And I think Andy, again, sorry, Andy, I keep quoting you. It's not effective for risks that are happening every 2 years or every 3 years. And the assumption, the conventional wisdom, which is kind of changing now, is that governments should retain that risk, that they, you know, they should use it to their reserves, their national disaster funds. Most countries, those funds don't have money, or they have the contingency reserve, but that contingency reserve could be used for so many things. So when that hurricane comes, when that drought comes, the money isn't there. So how do we deal with those lower level risk layers? So that's, you know, it's really hard to get buy-in for those top layers if you're not thinking of the whole risk spectrum. Mohammed, over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Shakira. Yeah, very well explained. And in my argument, again, I'm just referring back to the budget issue. For example, I'm going to use my own country as an example. Such a tiny budget, okay, compared to neighboring countries like Kenya and Ethiopia. And we were celebrating about 24.5% of budget increase from 2024 to 2025. And that only increased about, I think, a third of $1 billion, something like that. And you're talking about the entire budget of a country. And the question was always like, how do we prioritize and what do we do? Of course, like every country have got their own issues. We've got also a massive conflict issue, right, which needs a top priority. So the politicians will always tell you, this year we're going to allocate some funds for WASH or healthcare or education, like, the most basic needs of every country. But at the end of the day, people will tell you, like, listen, okay, the reality is that security is our #1 priority. And maybe if we're lucky, we're going to also try to intervene and assist with humanitarian assistance. And that's still using external offset, off budget. And that off budget we talked about here yesterday that, in this year, we estimate about 300 to, I think, 500 million in USAID funds alone being missing from that fund. And therefore, immediately you have about a quarter of the entire population being affected by that. And then all of a sudden, within 1 year, you will hear like about 4 million people are food insecure. So when you're dealing with that hand-to-mouth situation, then arranging a pre-finance situation, I know countries are different. I'm talking about a fragile context. It's extremely hard and extremely difficult. Yet again, we tried also to, we were now a member of an assignee to African Rescue Capacity, which we also get plenty of support. But again, it has its own challenges, and maybe I'll have the opportunity to talk about it a little bit later. So I'm going to leave it like that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So some robust responses from the two teams. I'm going to hand it over to the audience now. If you have any questions or you want to come in, maybe supporting one side or another of the argument or providing some further nuance, but we'd really like to hear from you. Yes, and hopefully there's a mic somewhere. I'll take gentleman at the back.
Hello. Sorry. Yes, my name's Alan Harding. I used to be a senior economic advisor at DFID back in the day when the UK believed in aid and international development. Apologies on behalf of what's happened since. Sorry, these questions are comments. So I have a sort of comment that's a kind of a question. So to the lady from the Caribbean, I've got 2 suggestions for you. Oh, sorry. Oh, well, both. One's a bit more orthodox and one's a bit unorthodox. So very quickly, the orthodox thing, it seems to me, and forgive me, I don't know the Caribbean intimately, but it strikes me that natural disasters in particular, when it affects the Caribbean, it doesn't affect just one bit of the Caribbean. You know, tornadoes, hurricanes, these things, they affect numerous countries. So the solution possibly could be pooling. So pooling risks is always usually a good idea. And is there not a role for regional institutions like the Caribbean Development Bank to take out insurance on behalf of all of you, and you contribute based upon your ability to pay, something like that? So that's the orthodox suggestion. The unorthodox one is, so as far as I know, in the Bahamas, you've got quite a lot of wealthy people, and they have nice yachts. So if I was advising your Minister of Finance, I would basically suggest to him to embargo or take control of those yachts and only let the owners back on them when they've signed up to agree to pay for this. Because when again, when tornadoes hits, those yachts are affected. So, you know, get wealthy people to pay. That's my other suggestion.
Thanks very much. Let's take one or two more, and then I'll ask the teams to respond.
Hi, thanks. I'm Carl from ODI. I guess it wasn't explicit, but does the humanitarian system provide something of a disincentive for buying these instruments? And could they be incentivized a bit better than they are presently? You know, it seems like we're collectively asking countries to tie their hands. Other countries have done this in other ways, whether it's monetary policy or other things. Often there's a kind of benefit to doing it that might be broader than the actual payout, for example. And I wonder, is there things that like the international community might be doing to better incentivize countries to tie their hands in this way a little bit?
Thanks, Cathal. I'm just going to take one. There's one question online. To those who call it a luxury, when a disaster occurs and a risk cover instruments pay out, do you still consider it a luxury? That's a provocative question. And then one more, I think. A couple more. We'll take these two, and then we'll get some responses to all of those.
Thank you for giving this opportunity. I want to say that arranging for finances is not a luxury, but how is it practical in a situation when you have threatening the debt sustainability? How do you put aside and borrow money when the debt is threatening to be unsustainable? But budgeting for SOC, where you put money aside within the budget, is a good thing, but not where you borrow to put money aside. That means budgeting is that a situation may happen like the front, and if they happen, you have to address by money without disrupting the operation of the other budget. But borrowing is where it's an issue where you can borrow and put it aside for eventuality which you don't know it will come. When you have threatening budget deficits and you are limited raising of resources to pay for that. But you can budget, put some money aside. But what happened in Kenya is that when you are budgeting, you put some money aside for eventuality, but the end of financial year, that money is streamlined to the other budget if that situation doesn't happen. But you don't go and borrow the issue board for that kind of a situation.
Okay, thank you. Maybe reflect on that. I think we'll take one more, and then we'll have some quick responses before we move into the next.
So I'd actually like the views of everyone on the panel on this. So when I was working in government, the default assumption was that you finance disasters. This is before the tsunami when I first started. The big tsunami that hit Asia, sorry.
I'm sorry, introduce yourself.
Ratin Roy, I'm an economist. I work in a university in India now. So the default assumption we would make was we'd make it pay as you go. So when something awful happens, we'd probably need about 1% of GDP fiscal deficit. So we'll write that into the fiscal rule, saying if a disaster happens, then we suspend the fiscal rule, something related to what you're saying, for that limited period, you know? So if the target is 5.5%, you can go in a disaster year to 6.5. Till the tsunami hit. And then we began to realize, other people began to realize, that actually some precautionary money that is taken from the budget and kept outside it is very good to prepare for the current expenditure requirements that have to be paid for when a shock exists. So broadly, that would mean that you would have basically two ways of financing it. One, a current expenditure target. So let's say you need $1 million or $10 million, and you need that from previous experience when a shock hits. So you have that in a fund that is off budget, and that is part of the asset balance sheet of the government, but not part of regular budgetary operations. And that fund is replenished when a shock hits and only when a shock hits. And then you have a borrowing ceiling relaxation provision in the fiscal responsibility legislation, if you have some, otherwise it's not a problem, which you deal with for the sort of capex and the sort of scale financing needs. What do you think?
Thank you. I think we'll have to leave it there and go back to the teams. Maybe we can start with Catherine. You respond to any of the questions or comments that you would like.
So with respect to pooling the risk of the region, there is a Caribbean insurance program called CRIF, where the countries in the region pool their insurance risk. Parametric insurance triggers around a certain level of destruction from a hurricane. And the idea of getting wealthy people to pay for is very much a strategy of some of our folks, and for designated areas, but not necessarily for disaster relief. Although there is a kind of a resilience fund tourism tax, so that would contribute to it. And to clarify on the instruments that are available, not all of them require cash up front. Okay, so debt pause clauses that indirectly provides cash flow because you can divert funds that would have been used for debt service to support disaster relief efforts. And of course, contingency lines, there might be a small fee, or contingency grants, disaster grants wouldn't require any funding up front. So, and the disadvantage, or I guess the one reservation some countries may have with respect to contingency loans, those are loans that a multilateral might provide if a disaster happens, is that would count towards their cap for a country. So if you allocate 160 million for your contingency loan, then that won't be available for direct financing for immediate needs. So not everything requires direct cash input. So it's not necessarily, taking from your current budget. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's fine. Should we, Kip, which of those would you like to take?
I can speak to Carl's point on sort of the humanitarian system. Yeah, important actor in the space, and very important in terms of if you look at what work that they're doing on the ground. There is a sort of disincentive, I guess, from government. If somebody else is taking care of that risk, then why bother looking at that? So it's contingent risk, but it's also contingent outside my books. I think what's happened right now with the whole shock to the system is sort of now we need to put it on our books now. I think it will sort of start feeding into the system right now, but we haven't seen the full effects of it, if I'd call it that, in terms of what that looks like. In terms of incentives, I think there's a lot of humanitarian organizations which are quite proactive in this space. They've seen some of the benefits, some of the issues, and they're really great at sort of helping others who sort of coming into designing this product, and working with governments into sort of developing the systems to make it work. Like when Mohammed mentioned some of the wash products that they've done, to understand vulnerability aspects, you rely on the humanitarian partners who are on the ground to actually do that. So there's an incentive for them. Can we use them as sort of data providers? Can we use them as sort of interlocutors with the government partners? It's not a perfect marriage. It's tough. When you put two individuals who've never really worked together before, it's tough. So it's happening at a small scale. What I can say, similar to what the risk pool that was mentioned by Catherine, we're doing pockets of stuff. When we get to scale, when we see them, when we stop experimenting and actually do them properly, I think the time is now to do them properly, because the system has been shocked enough to sort of we need to do things differently. And to your point on sort of the pay-as-you-go sort of scheme, I really like that idea and see how we can manage it. The problem is it comes to the political aspect. If you put money on the side and the minister is trying to fill something, it'll definitely come and get it. And to this point is like, and maybe I'm being a bit unruly here, and it's great that the ODI invited me, where Ministry of Finance are. I was like, do we need a go-between between the Ministry of Finance and this sort of DRF managing disasters in the future? Because maybe finance is not the place for it. It needs a home somewhere. Is there a need? If you look at the private sector, there's a chief risk officer who's sort of in charge of that stuff. maybe the minister is too busy, Minister of Finance is too busy trying to sort out those bills, and where that fund could potentially sit is with somebody else who has a whole system view. Because right now, Minister of Finance he needs to pay the bills right now. He's looking at agriculture, he's looking at health, he's looking at all this sort of other areas. Where's somebody who can take a bird's eye view, take a step back and sort of look at it? And maybe it's not the Ministry of Finance, maybe it's somebody else.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to Isatu online if you have any further reflections on those comments, questions.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Wanted to come in here to also add to Kathy's response. So there was this colleague who has requested that let's have the rich individuals in Bahamas who owns those here to contribute to. For me, I think it's easier said than done. And for me, the real question here is about climate justice, and the question really lies elsewhere. And we have seen that and emitted the so much to the atmosphere that is causing this global warming are the ones responsible for the damages we face in our small islands and countries as well. And yet, we've witnessed that many are reluctant to fulfill their obligations. So for me, the issue of climate justice is quite important, and it's important that we have these nations to take responsibility. So basically, when he said, let's have those rich people to pay, I basically laughed because it's easier said than done, like I had said. And I would want to also respond to a comment. I forgot the name of the individual, but he really elaborated the fact that it's really difficult for government to set aside resources when they have to respond to some of these competing social needs, which is quite true. And Sakira has said that most of our countries have these disaster risk funds, but most of these funds don't have resources. It's basically the fact. And in the Gambia, that's the same issue we're grappling with as well. And the issue is because of physical space and the debt burden that most of our countries experience. For instance, in the Gambia here, almost 40% of our domestic resources are used to finance are used for debt servicing. So it really shows the limited physical space that the government really has to really set aside resources to respond to climate shocks. But for me, I think we, as a country and as a government, we need to really ensure that we have a risk-layered approach as we are contributing participate in the ARC risk pooling mechanism, which is quite important. And we had this CAD-DDO with the World Bank, but these are all meant for larger scale climate shocks. So, and given the fact that year in, year out, we have this flooding that happens and government has to reallocate resources from other priorities to respond to these small shocks. For me, I think it gives that justification why government needs to set small amounts of resources for these small shocks, so that we really help our communities to really build their resilience and really reach out to them when at a time when they need it most. I know it will be quite challenging, but it's something that we can't do away with, and we really need to start being proactive in responding to the climate shocks we experience in our countries. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time a little bit. I want to move on to the next segment, but let me give Mohammed and Shakira a chance to maybe respond to some of the questions that haven't quite been covered yet. So, Mohammed.
Yeah, just very quickly, I just want to address the issue of contingency planning because it came back several times, like failure to plan, of course, is dangerous. And being proactive rather than reactive is a very good thing. For us, for example, we concluded what we call a national transformation plan, for example, same as NDPs, right? And for climate resilience, of course, it was decided that it should be one of the key pillars, therefore priorities for national issues. But having said that, okay, like this is not only enough, because you want to be you want to be advocating this to be part of the budget, and therefore the question of luxury comes back to you all the time. And then you got to be able to convince Ministry of Finance. I work with the Ministry of Planning. It's economic development, but most countries, Ministry of Finance and Planning are the same, but ours is quite different. We kind of complement each other. We work together, but at the same time, there's a lot of, rivalries happening because we custodian of national policies, and the national policy should be reflected in the fiscal space in the national budgets. And sometimes we succeed. For example, like if I want to argue differently now, for example, last year, not last year, 2023, 2024, we succeeded, of course, to sign up to African Risk Capacity, Insurance Capacity, and the government accepted this. This is like, after a long while of back and forth, and the politicians sometimes, failing to understand why the importance of pre-planning, why the importance of buying this, why the importance of putting up partners as a replica, reaching out to donors, maybe supporting with the premiums on behalf of our countries, etc., etc. But that actually needs from contingency planning from the bottom, and then making that up to the national policies, and making sure that it's included in the national budget, and the acceptance. It's a very bottom-up approach that needs to be linked. And if one breaks, the whole chain doesn't work. And in order not to break that, then you got to convince so many different stakeholders and etc. So thank you.
Just very quick, because I think the online piece is like, if it pays out, is it a luxury? One thing I've learned, like looking at the different DRF instruments and thinking, is it good value for money? It's more than the payout. It has to actually incentivize, and Carl, you mentioned this, what are the incentives to incentivize people to start thinking, if that thing happens, what am I going to do with that money? A lot of cases, I'm sure like a lot of people here who've had experience working in government or, as a MDB or as a lender, absorption capacity is an issue. It becomes even more difficult during a crisis. In a lot of cases, the payout actually might sit there for a year or a couple of months. But what made that a good value for money, that instrument cost effective, was the assumption that it would get money out the door in 2 weeks. And if that breaks, then that's no longer cost effective. So it's not only about whether or not you got a payout. And even if you don't get a payout, maybe your instrument wasn't designed for that crisis. So just really knowing what your trigger is and what you're buying. So I'll just stop there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we've come out of our team positions a little bit there, but yeah, everyone can reflect on which arguments they found particularly convincing. And we'll move on to the next topic for debate. So back with your team hats on. Financing to prepare and respond to disasters should be provided in a way that gives governments maximum flexibility in how they use a payout or a disbursement, rather than being earmarked for specific purposes or tied to a specific plan. So I'm going to start with Resilience Rising team. Shakira, what's your view?
So thanks, Emily. I wanted to start with a disclaimer of sorts. Mohammed and I are planning people. When I started working in government, a little more than 15 years ago in Trinidad, it was Ministry of Planning. Mohammed is currently employed in the Ministry of Planning. I've done a lot of plans. And I'm sad to say a lot of them weren't implemented. And a lot of those plans had nothing to do with disasters. 50% of the time the plans were forgotten. People and someone else, a new government came to power and they created a new plan. That's another story. It becomes even more difficult to follow a plan when disasters strike. Systems are disrupted, priorities change, political dynamics are upended. So that brings me to my first argument that's more in favor of flexibility than really saying if you get a payout, this is what the money has to use by expenditure item by expenditure item. So I think is recognizing that rigid earmarking and plans are not a panacea, and that there is evidence that doing a plan itself does not automatically lead to faster or more predictable responses once a disaster occurs. And that's because there are bottlenecks that require solutions beyond plans. And this has really been demonstrated by the experience of the African Risk Capacity Limited, ARC for short, which we spoke about briefly in the first intervention. But just to remind some people, ARC is a sovereign risk pool for African countries, which bring them together to pool their risk. And by doing that, they could access risk transfer at a lower cost. The current risk pool has about 12 African countries, and Somalia is one of those countries. A key requirement for ARC is to purchase an insurance policy is that you have to prepare a contingency plan that says, if you get a payout, this is what it'll be used for. The assumption here is that that would accelerate deployment and reduce delays, as key stakeholders will know what resources are available and what's expected from them. And that would improve coordination and planning. Sounds plausible on paper. One of the beautiful things about ARC is that it is one of the most transparent DRF mechanisms out there for governments. It has completed a series of independent, publicly available evaluations. The most recent evaluation was done, published last year. And what it concluded is that while most countries had good contingency plans in place for assistance delivery, they have not systematically resulted in more timely assistance, which is the primary objective of the plans and key for the ARC value proposition. What does it mean? It meant that households weren't able to avoid negative coping strategies. So droughts happened, and what happened is that the households, the poor vulnerable households, they took on expensive loans, they sold assets, they reduced food consumption. So the plan itself isn't enough, right? And this is due to the prerequisites that weren't in place in the case in some of these cases. One, the PFM system was weak for the receipt and release of funds. So procurement, distribution of assistance, targeting, there were weaknesses that weren't addressed. There was also like limited political buy-in into the urgency of the actions. Like people, okay, yes, they eventually did implement the plan, but it wasn't on the timeline that was required. And there's also something called basis risk in the DRF space, which is when an instrument, there's a lack of clarity in whether the instrument should trigger or whether the conditions were met, especially, it's a problem with parametric insurance products. And that takes time to clarify whether this was a basis risk event, and hence the payout should be triggered. So really, what I really want to say is that simply having a plan in place or earmarking does not resolve these deeper structural issues. And we really need to understand what those bottlenecks are and what the solutions may be to address them. It may involve some element of earmarking, contingency planning, but in some cases it may not. The second point I want to make is related to capacity. I know for a lot of small island states, when we talk about climate funds, we say that there's a lot of requirements. So I'm sometimes worried about how in pushing certain instruments, are we imposing more requirements on governments who don't have capacity to do those requirements as well as their day-to-day job. So you really have to think where in environments where those foundational systems aren't currently in place, are they, requiring, to do very detailed plans? Is it worth it? I will say that, and I have also seen like a lot of earmark funds, how they could complicate budget execution, reporting, and oversight, especially in low capacity environments. So to me, what's really needed in this space is like, how do we create smart guardrails rather than rigid walls? And Ratin spoke about disaster funds, and I see that idea coming up more about how you do ring fence accounts with flexible execution. So it's kind of on the right of, if you think of it as a spectrum, right of rigid earmarking, but not maximum flexibility. I will say that some of the contingent loans and grants from the MDBs, they're policy-based loans, budget support programs, which is maximum flexibility for governments, but they do come with policy actions. So the question is, to what extent are those policy actions helping to create that ecosystem where you could actually use DRF payouts wisely? Because I think thinking by instrument it's not going to be a system approach. We need to think more large scale. There is a last thing about demand, but I'll stop there because I'm over time.
We come back to that. Let's hear from the other team, from Isato online. Maximum flexibility for these DRF instruments, is that a good thing?
Emily, I would start by saying I agree with most of the points Sakira highlighted. They are brilliant points as well. However, I think it will be important to highlight that in moments of crisis, speed and sovereignty that's what saves lives. But without accountability, flexibility becomes fragility. So and for me, I think this is why pre-defined disaster response and financing planning are not merely administrative tools, but they are instruments of trust, credibility, and resilience. And why I say this is because in small countries like the Gambia that heavily depend on external assistance, having pre-arranged disaster response and financing plans is not just a good practice, but it's a necessity because this is what donors want to see. And they would really use this use this to demonstrate that a country has a clear and accountable system in place for committing their resources. So having a structured plan for us demonstrates readiness, foresight and physical discipline. And it gives assurance that the funds will not be lost in bureaucratic delays or diverted to unrelated expenditure, but channeled directly to where they are needed most. And this has been something that has been emphasized over the years when we've been working on disaster risk financing. So this transparency and preparedness actually unlocks faster disbursement, and I would say it helps us to attract larger volumes of aid. And my second point would be that plans, having predefined plans, it's transparency. It's the cornerstone of transparency, and both domestically, I would say, and internationally. And when a country has a clear plan and guidelines for how funds would be triggered, allocated, and reported, it reduces the scope of political interference and misuse. And we have been participating in ARC since 2014. And when we received a payout, having that operational plan, operational contingent plan really helped us to ensure that the decisions that we are making are objective and that they are being used for preset vulnerability threshold rather than political favoritism or personal interest. So for us, that's why we see these as very having plans being a very good instruments to really enhance transparency. But on the other hand, I would say it empowers technocrats because having this well-structured disaster risk financing and response plan empowers us and local responders to act in a timely manner during crisis. And given the fact that it highlights the roles, responsibilities, and financing flows, it really helps us to map out the key interventions that we had in advance identified, and really helps us to act swiftly in an evidence-based manner. And it safeguards us as technocrats as well. And we really see these as very important instruments. Before waiting for ad hoc budget reallocation or emergency approval, it really helps us to mobilize the resources in a quickly manner to respond to the crisis that we are experiencing. So I would say that empowering technocrats really strengthens institutional capacity and our professional integrity as well, ensuring that we respond in a timely manner and our response are guided by technical evidence and national priorities rather than short-term political experiences. So in the long term, I would say this would hopefully foster the resilience that we want for our communities. So in essence, I would say preparation is power, and a nation that plans ahead earns trust and it protects its people as well and ensures that every dollar that we spend on actions are not just meant for saving lives, but preserving our credibility and strengthening our sovereignty as well. Thank you. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you very much. I'm convinced. That sounds good to me. I don't know if you want to come back in, Mohammed and Shakira, on how do we get the balance really between the kind of flexibility that clearly is important and the transparency and the kind of preparedness and more reliability that the other team were talking about.
I think it's a very important question, Emily. And to get the balance right, sometimes it's not really easy. A lot of my colleagues, because I told them about I'm going to be taking part in this debate, that a lot of them said that disaster funding should be flexible. So government can use it where it's most needed, right? Rather than being to follow strict rules on how to spend it. And this is like a quote from them. But at the same time, we know that like it's not like a one-way road. It's often a lot more complex than that. And I say that because sometimes it's difficult to plan things. And again, as Shakira said, that I work with the Ministry of Planning, and I've been working for the ministry for quite some time. You can plan things, but plans don't always, go according to plans. And some of my colleagues also said, like, we should be flexible because the climate change is so unpredictable. And if you make those two statements, sometimes you would say, what are you talking about? But in reality, is that, for example, I was in a town called Baidoa in Somalia, and back in 2023, where we had El Nino, and because we relied so much on ICPALT, Weather Prediction Center, and we have our multi-hazard early warning center, we did a lot of plans. We did a lot of AA, like anticipatory action plans, and we worked hard for it. And we didn't expect any rains to come in that particular area as well. And we told everyone else. And the next night, you know what happened? The half of the town, flooded. About, unfortunately, 12 people died, and it was a mess. And everyone was saying that, oh, I thought you planned, I thought you told us this and that. And immediately, because we're part of African Risk Capacity, like, the trigger points. And it puts me like a very difficult position as well, because I sit at the governing board of ARC, representing East Africa. We have an issue, for example, this year we had a payout, and that payout was announced back in February. In March, I think the following month, we had a massive empty check saying that, oh, we've been awarded like $2.5 million, like as a trigger of that. And then it took another 2 months to process that, right? And then the payout finally arrived in July, I think. And we finally, I was part of the mission last month, and we finally, paid. So it took basically 6 to 7 months. And then people sometimes ask you, where's the planning of that? But at the end of the day, you know, it's a lot more complex, a lot more complicated, and countries differ. And in fragile states, it's even a lot more difficult. So what I would say is that I think flexibility should be there, but it depends on the degree of how flexible they are and how impactful they are at the end of the day to the ground, and how you respond to the people in need. Because at the end of the day, we're working to reach out to the most vulnerable groups, and if that makes tweaking the plans and making sure like it fits and implies to those groups, that let it be. And yeah, I would leave it like that. Thank you.
Great. We'll come back to the, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, taking off the debate hat, there's this saying from, I think, Eisenhower that says, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. It is the process of, you know, actually thinking through a problem. And Andy, again, sorry, I keep referencing what you said because it was so great. I was listening, yeah, about scenario planning and just like thinking of the possibilities and thinking, okay, these are the actors that need to be involved. This is the data we might need. Okay, maybe we need to open that bank account, change that law. I think that process, it's not going to happen overnight. And like, I'm sorry if I'm being so harsh on the ARC evaluation. The fact that they have an evaluation that says this has been the problem, we need to fix this. So maybe if they do fix it, the next contingency plan could have the desired impact. It's not linear, it's not technical, it is political, but I think it's a journey that a lot of countries are on. So I think you can't just have financial preparedness, which is just getting the instrument and the payout. You need operational preparedness, because otherwise that first one isn't going to change anything, and it's not going to help poor and vulnerable people. There was something else, but I'm going to stop there. Yeah.
That's okay. And you can maybe come back in the Q&A session. So let's go back for final set of responses from our Resilience Revolution team. Who'd like to go first?
Yeah, thanks. I think all those valid points, I think what I started to mention was sort of perfect. Nothing to add to that, though. Just to respond to some of the statements have been made. I think the African Risk Capacity, and I can adduce to this because I used to work there, has done a lot in terms of the contingency planning and sort of putting it all out there. But the question is, the transparency of those contingency plans gets punished for not working as it should. Whereas it's an experiment. We're all trying to fix a system we all know is broken, but we get punished for trying to fix it. Is there an incentive, and I'm trying to look at the positives in this, is there an incentive for trying to sort of tweak this? Daniel is in the audience from the center, and I forget how many days, how many months does it take official IDA assistance to get to a country? It's over a year. And nobody ever speaks about that. Before the World Bank disperses money for an emergency assistance, it's over a year, whereas this guys did it in 4 months. I think that's work to be done, but something that we need to think about. The second point is, I think it's quite healthy that we are having this debate. I think we're talking about Africa and the Caribbean, but ultimately, all of us are in this, and it's sort of a unifying factor, because if you look at what happened during COVID, it was all a mess. Nobody knew what to do. We had all the best plans, even in where we're sitting right now, but how to execute them was a complete disaster. And I think if we haven't learned from that, it just shows us that we have so much to do to sort of get that operational guys. So aspects such as ARC and DRF tools that are being used, learning points, experiments, that we are sort of moving in the right direction. So it's good things that developing countries are actually showing this and being transparent and using these tools. And that addresses sort of Shakir's point, sort of the political system. We are moving. I don't know what about the developed countries. Are they moving in the same direction? If another COVID hits, would they be as prepared as Mohammed in Somalia with his contingency plan, which is already there? And to speak to that contingency plan that's there, I think when we started having conversations in Somalia, probably 9-10 years ago, about taking off an insurance product, the benefit of starting that conversation, that conversation sort of 10 years prior to it, was we were able to know who's actually in the room. So when you're looking for somebody from the Ministry of Planning versus looking for somebody in the Ministry of Education, for the Ministry of Water, if this was a siloed decision-making process that was taking place at the Ministry of Finance, they take out an insurance policy, they take out different financial instruments, and then when the payout comes, we like literally just finding out who's dealing with this aspect is a complete game changer. So I think although they might be tedious, it might be quite challenging getting everybody in the same room and understanding what everybody's doing. I think it just sort of opens up sort of like, oh, there's that program happening in this ministry and that program happening in this NGO, because that brings together everybody around the same room. So I think it might not work as we envisaged it in theoretical format and the way we sculpted the contingency plan day one, but just by the fact that we have thought about it, I think opens up the conversation to a much higher level than it currently is. I don't know what the lessons learned. Again, Andy's left the room. I think we've referenced him so much because of what happened, but the conversation of the lessons learned from COVID and what the UK actually did. I'm not quite sure whether that's been taken forward and put out there as eloquently as the reviews from the ARC policy are being done. But those sort of conversations need to happen more and even more. So it's sort of hard to sort of say yes or no to this debate, and I'm on both sides. Catherine, sorry.
I think from the discussion, it's clear that maximum flexibility is out, right? We're all agreed that we need a plan, but we need plans that we can implement and that work. And that's where the work lies, in putting in place plans that are flexible, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen or how, but we know that we need to have some guidelines that are going to be based on national priorities for how we're going to deal with situations that we know will arise in the future. So that's where I'd leave it.
Great, thank you very much to our teams here. We've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So if anybody has any burning questions, points they would like to make in regard to the second discussion around plans and flexibility, please go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Daniel Clark from Centre for Disaster Protection. So my question is, for many of the risks we were hearing about in the first session, the first panel discussion, nobody on the stage was arguing for earmarking for trade shocks, for other sorts of shocks. But we are having this conversation about disaster risks and about earmarking. So I think my question just to the group is, what makes disaster risks different, if it does? And if I can sort of provide a starter for 10, is it that the risks are very contentious, and in terms of who pays for the cost is quite fragmented? Often the person most able to manage the risks, to mitigate, to reduce the risks, is not necessarily the person who will end up paying if everything goes wrong. Somebody else will provide the bailout. And is it really, if I'm the risk owner, it's not so much about me pre-arranging risk, it's about whoever's going to come to the rescue, whether it be finance ministry, if you're a local government or a person or a farmer, or if you're a national government, it's the international community. Is it really around wanting, whoever's going to bail you out to actually provide prearranged finance? Because when you look at the evidence for prearranged finance, the evidence is strongest when you've got this fragmentation of risk. So there's the series of 2 impact evaluations in Mexico, which have astonishing results in terms of the impact of this scheme. And that was a situation where whether federal government pays for the cost of reconstruction or whether state government pays, so subnational government, was very contentious. It took 2 years for them to argue who was going to pay to rebuild the road. And really what that scheme was doing was trying to address that politics through this sort of pre-agreed system. But the question is, what makes disasters different, or should we think about disasters differently to some of these other kind of shocks? What is the feature that is different that means that we're even having this conversation about earmarking?
Okay, we'll just take one more question from online, which is for Mohammed, really. So for Somalia, sort of linked to a point Daniel was making, what do you think are the best ways to think of disaster risk financing in a federal structure like yours, where federal member states own their own budgets and are revenue constrained, but depend heavily on grants from federal government. So I think we'll just have responses to those two questions and then wrap up the session. Catherine, would you like to go first?
Why did I let you?
Danny, I thought you put your hand up to confirm the IDA number, the time frame. But I'll let that slide. We can catch up afterwards. What makes this disaster risk sort of different? I think because nobody's in charge. Nobody is sort of taking the risk. So if we look at droughts in East Africa, we have some layers of people in charge, or we have some layers of some protection, but up to a point where it's just there's a cliff, and they were like, who's in charge of this risk? So if it's, for example, if it's trade, and we're looking at trade right now, there's a minister of trade, there's a minister of finance that directly affects his budget, that effectively, and they'll be running around, scuttering around, trying to find trade deals and other aspects like that. Whereas in DRF, as you correctly point out, the ultimate beneficiary or the ultimate person who's going to suffer from this is probably unrepresentative in some system of government or some system of society. So it falls upon society in general, but the unifying factor in society is obviously the government. So that social contract with government that we have, ultimately, somebody within that structure needs to take charge. Historically, and to Carl's point, it's fallen on the humanitarian sector, and I think the last 30 years that's sort of trodden along, and nobody sort of asked any questions in terms of how that system works. But I think that 70 billion that's going to go out of the system overnight from this year has now sort of raised that contention a bit clearly. But ultimately, there's no risk owner. So for you to be a risk owner, or for you to be a risk carrier, then we are all sort of carrying it in our own different institutions, whereas we're looking for who's going to be actually take of this risk. So I think that's what makes this space contentious. Nobody wants to take this risk, and there's a reason why nobody wants to take this risk. Sorry.
I'll just add, in our case, and I can't believe we're the only ones, there's a disaster relief or disaster risk management agency, and they've evolved over the years. It started out as a kind of a partnership between government and civil society, and then it became a government department. I don't know that it's not a full ministry now, but on its way, and it'll take some time, I believe, for that unit to have the kind of weight, influence, I don't know, recognition, to take on fully. So they're allocated it. If a hurricane's coming, you're in charge, right? Marshal your resources and, put things in place. But for them to be at a point where this allocation for disaster relief goes to your kitty and outside of the hands of the Ministry of Finance, or it's going to take a little time, I think, for them to develop that stature in government. But I think that's definitely the direction that it's going in. But there, naturally there'll be some resistance, and it'll take a little time to get there. But I think that's what we need. And I'm sure other countries are doing it, probably in our region. But that's where we are.
Thank you. Let's go online to Isatu. If you can respond in 1 minute, we're running out of time. That would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And for me, what makes disaster is different is the fact that the hazard basically affects our economy, social, and environmental systems. And this is why it's very important for us to consider disaster risk management in our economic and development plans, because if we fail to integrate disaster risk in our development efforts, basically we are preventing sustainable development in our countries. So for me, that's what makes disaster risk different, and it's why it's so much important in this time we are, given the fact that we have increasing and frequent disasters in our countries, it's quite important that we treat it differently and so we achieve sustainable development in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mohammed, over to you.
Yeah, just quickly responding to the question on the federal government and federal member states, especially in disaster risk finance, is also another governance challenge because of the fragmentation, because of the political sometimes differences, and it's completely another layer that we have to deal with. Like once all the discussions are completed between the donors, Somalia, and the replica groups, then you have at this stage where I was a member of a delegation that goes to a state, and then that state must be convinced that it's targeting the right people, and they have to give you the okay. Even though the federal government has the single treasury account and has the monetary policies and in charge of that, then you still have to work with sub-federal member states to be able to achieve that. And that's where the implementation happens. And if you get that wrong, everything else you did at the top means nothing. So consensus is often the thing that takes a lot of time and effort, sometimes more than the other contingency planning. And this is what we have to deal with all the time. And just very quickly about what makes the disaster risk different. And I think this is a very interesting question. It's different because it affects every aspect of life, but it's even more different because disasters do not discriminate, right? It will not say respected elder and a wealthy leave that alone. It will affect everyone the same. And therefore, I think when we do advocacies, especially in our own countries, that we need to repeat this, all the time for community mobilization and advocacy. Thank you.
Just very quickly, and thank you for giving a lot of time to think about Daniel's question. Part of me is like, is it about causality? Like, if a drought or a tropical cyclone happens, you could say this was the impact because it's so visible. I know not all disasters are visible, like droughts and floods. Sometimes it's less than an earthquake or a tropical cyclone. So because of that causality, you could assess the impact on infrastructure, on people. So then you're able to think of the solution to address that impact. While things like trade, other kind of shocks, the transmission channel is more complicated, and that probably the solution is more complicated as well. It's just thinking out loud, and let's continue this conversation, guys. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Great questions. Thanks very much to the debate teams for a really great discussion. In summary, planning is critical, but plans don't always go to plan. I like that quote. So we need to be flexible with them. Disaster risk finance is really tricky, fiscally, politically, and in terms of kind of capacity constraints. But there are some instruments and interventions that can help with that, help overcome some of those challenges. And I guess overall, what we want to be saying, we haven't gone into in this panel, is that we need DRF plus longer term investments in resilience to avoid some of these sort of unthinkable, unmanageable fiscal and physical and humanitarian impacts of disasters, particularly as they accelerate and deepen. So thank you very much. Thanks for being a great panel, debate teams, and thanks very much to the audience.